Thank you very much for coming. My name is Mark Sheeland. I'm Director of Programs and Government Relations here at the Middle East Institute. We're very pleased that you all have joined us for this presentation and discussion with Milton Viorst about his new book entitled Zionism, the Birth and Transformation of an Ideal. Milton Viorst is an esteemed journalist who covered the Middle East for over 30 years and has authored more than half a dozen books on the region. We're delighted that he accepted our invitation to speak at MEI about his new book. Speaking with Milton in today's program will be Matthew Duss from the Foundation for Middle East Peace, our next-door neighbor here at MEI. Matt is a scholar on Middle Eastern affairs, widely published commentator and policy analyst. We're grateful to Matt for taking part in this event and for the frequent and valuable collaborations between the Middle East Institute and FMEP. MEI's next public policy event will be a week from this Wednesday, so on July 27th. We'll host author Shadi Hamid and several expert colleagues for a discussion of Shadi's new book, Islamic Exceptionalism. Please check our website at mei.edu to register for that event. It's now my pleasure to turn the proceedings over to Matt Duss. Matt is president of the Foundation for Middle East Peace, a nonprofit organization whose mission is to promote a just solution to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict through education and advocacy. Matt is well known in Washington policy circles as an analyst on Israel and Palestine. His commentaries appear regularly in the print and broadcast media. Before joining FMEP, he was director of the Middle East Progress Program at the Center for American Progress. Matt will share some opening words on this evening's topic, formally introduce Milton for his presentation, and later moderate the conversation with Milton and with all of you. After Matt closes the discussion at 6:30, we'll have copies of the book available for purchase, and Milton will kindly stick around to sign them for those of you who buy a book today. It's at a discount price, so please jump on it. And weather permitting, there will be some refreshments either in the garden or probably it's looking like in here. Thank you again for joining us this evening. Matt, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Mark, and thank you to MEI. It's a pleasure to be here, as always, and a particular pleasure to be able to moderate this event with Milton Viorst as a student and an analyst of the Middle East, going back to my days as a student reading his work. He's been covering the Middle East since the 1960s, so it's a real privilege and honor to be able to be the one to kind of chat with him up here, which I would enjoy even if none of you were here, I guarantee. I won't say very much. I'll just say briefly about his book. It's a subject that's been written about in some depth before, but I think the approach he takes here, looking at some of these key leaders and thinkers throughout the history of modern Zionism, is really a very interesting approach, and I think it sets up the situation, the political situation in Israel right now with great depth and great facility. So I look forward to the conversation with Milton afterward, and happy to turn it over to you. Thank you for being with us.
It's a great pleasure to be here. I have a long association with the Middle East Institute, and I've spent a lot of time in the library here, but they snuck up on me, and while I was away working on something or other, they changed the whole area down here, so it's nice to have this auditorium to speak to you. And I also had a long and close association with Merle Thorpe, who was the founder of the Foundation for Middle East Peace, Matt's predecessor. And he was a close friend and an inspiration at a time when very few people were talking about Middle East peace. But I'm not sure how much progress any of us have made after spending close to a lifetime on the subject, but we're still punching away. That's, as the saying goes, that's what we do. Zionism, the book, opens with a prologue that looks at how the Enlightenment in the 18th century brought Europe into the modern era, shattering rabbinic control over the life of the Jews in Europe, as it shattered the church's monopoly over the Christians. The Enlightenment offered Jews living as inferiors throughout Europe the promise of emancipation, the right to be treated as equals in a society in which they were held as inferiors. Most rabbis didn't like the separation. They wanted to preserve their own control over the community. Jewish emancipation reached its apex during the French Revolution, which included them in the Declaration of the Rights of Man. And at the same time, French armies spread the idea of equality and freedom, even for Jews, across the continent. After that, the Enlightenment went downhill. Identified with the French Revolution, Jews were targeted by the reaction that followed the popular fatigue over Napoleon's wars. The Enlightenment was replaced by a nostalgia for the old days, the old ways. Aggressive nationalism, imbued with racism, surged. It's not that the Jews' emancipation was ever really popular, we have to admit that, or even worked very well. But throughout the 19th century, anti-Semitism rose from the ashes of medievalism and became a major political and social force. It was in response to that force that Zionism was born. Let me start by saying that, in case there's any doubt about it, and many of you have done me the honor of reading some of my books, starting with Matt, and I'm very touched by that. But in case there's any doubt, I'm a Zionist. And it's true that over the years, many Jews, particularly Jews in official positions, have objected to my criticisms of Israeli policies, but I would argue that that doesn't make me any less a Zionist. The common goal to which Zionists subscribe is a homeland where Jews can live free of anti-Semitism in peace and security. The differences within the Jewish community, and they are many and serious, are over how to get there. My book focuses on the men who shaped, whose fierce debates over the decades shaped Zionism and who never achieved a consensus among themselves. Their views still bitterly divide the Jews. The narrative begins, of course, with Theodor Herzl, the son of successful emancipated Jews who yearned to be assimilated into European society. Herzl was, as we all know, the founder of modern Zionism. But oddly, he cared rather little about Judaism, and he didn't even like most Jews. He loved German culture, and as a failed playwright turned journalist, he was slow to recognize the vicious anti-Semitism around him in Vienna, the city in which he lived. It was as a witness to the Dreyfus affair while he was working in Paris as a journalist that he became sensitized to the danger, and in 1895 published the book called The Jewish State, which laid out his blueprint for Jewish nationhood. The book wasn't an immediate success. Vienna's chief rabbi, an assimilationist, asked how he could expect Europe's sophisticated cultured Jews to live in Palestine growing tomatoes. More prophetically, he warned Herzl that a Jewish state could become as nationalist and as militarist as any in Europe. Herzl paid no attention. His objective was to find a home for Europe's increasingly threatened Jews, and it was limited to that. The following year, 1897, Herzl convened the First World Jewish Congress in Basel. Western European Jews barely noticed the event. Most of the several hundred who showed up as delegates were Jews living in East Europe under the Tsar, where the Enlightenment had hardly penetrated and anti-Semitism was at its worst. These Jews were strangers to Herzl. He knew nothing about, the Jews he knew were cultured and secular, while Eastern Jews wanted to preserve Jewish cultural values. As an Orthodox contingent, there was an Orthodox contingent also in Basel that was determined to infuse Zionism with traditional Judaism. Herzl grasped the obstacle of the Jews' diversity, but he was willing to defer decisions on the character of the Jewish state of the refuge. In 50 years, a Jewish state will exist, he predicted. He was off by only a single year. Herzl's strategy was to negotiate a charter with the Ottoman Sultan, which would give Zionism legal standing in Ottoman Palestine. In return, he promised to persuade rich Jewish financiers to make loans to the Sultan on favorable terms. In fact, however, he had no willing Jewish financiers, nor did he understand that the Sultan had no interest in turning Palestine over to the Jews. Year after year, nonetheless, Herzl made vain trips to Constantinople. Finally, with the pogroms in Russia intensifying, Britain offered Zionism a charter to set up a colony in East Africa, which the Eastern Europeans, now the most powerful force within Zionism, rejected on the grounds that only Palestine could be a Jewish home. Herzl died at the age of 44 in 1904, still puzzled over the Eastern Jews' response to Britain's offer, and convinced that his efforts in behalf of Zionism were a total failure. Well, they weren't. The movement Herzl founded was unstoppable, though in the decade that followed his death, it made no particular headway. Then World War I broke out. The Ottoman Empire trembled, and Palestine suddenly was up for grabs. Because Zionists were spread thin around all over Europe, Zionism resolved to avoid internal conflict by remaining officially neutral in the war. Still, Jews tended to side with one state or another, depending upon where they lived. And in England, a Russian-born chemist named Chaim Weizmann, who discovered a critical component for improving Britain's battlefield munitions, emerged as Zionism's dominant figure. Weizmann grasped that both camps, the Allies, Britain, France, and Russia on the one hand, Germany, Austria, and Turkey on the other, saw America as likely to be the decisive factor in the war, and they believed, probably with some obvious exaggeration, that American Jews had the power to shape the outcome. Britain had long been interested in Palestine. It entertained the idea that a Jewish Palestine, as part of the British Empire, could serve as a barrier against foreign designs on the Suez Canal. Britain also had a Christian aristocracy, to which Lord Arthur Balfour, the foreign minister, was prominent, that endorsed the Old Testament's promise of Palestine to the Jews. Weizmann brought to British deliberations on Palestine's future an uncanny ability to exploit the opportunities among Britain's ruling class to promote the Zionist cause. The deliberations weren't easy. Though he had Balfour on his side, Weizmann also faced a community of assimilated British Jews, most of them descendants of Iberian migrants of the pre-emancipation era, who feared that Zionism would undermine their eminent social position in Britain. The cabinet even called on President Wilson for an opinion. But it should be noted, and this is crucial, that there is no record of an Arab voice in these deliberations, though Arabs were a majority in Palestine and even had an army fighting alongside the British in the Middle East. In November 1917, the cabinet issued the Balfour Declaration announcing Britain's support for a Jewish national home in Palestine. But to Weizmann's dismay, it also pledged respect for the rights of the non-Jewish communities in Palestine, meaning the Arabs, a digression he blamed on Britain's assimilated non-Zionist Jews. The war was still not over when Weizmann journeyed for the first time to Jerusalem to establish Zionist institutions under the occupying British Army. But British forces, accustomed to working with Muslims in India, had no sympathy for Zionism, which stunned Weizmann. General Allenby, the commander of the British forces, anxious to finish off the Turks, asked Weizmann to reach out to the local Arabs to assure them that Zionism would do them no harm. Convinced that Britain had promised them their own nation after the war, the Arabs' position was that the Balfour Declaration was illegal and had to be rescinded. Weizmann duly delivered the message that Allenby asked for, promising that Zionism would be an asset to the Arabs, but the Arabs didn't believe a word he said. Soon afterward, Arab riots in Palestine broke out, shedding both Jewish and Arab blood. And since that time, as we all know, Jews and Arabs have engaged in virtually uninterrupted violence against each other. Weizmann made one serious, albeit misguided, effort at reaching a reconciliation with the Arabs. He crossed the desert into Jordan to meet with Prince Faisal, commander of the Arab army that fought against the Turks. Faisal, backed by his advisor, the celebrated Lawrence of Arabia, agreed to support the Jews' homeland in Palestine, though as a province of an Arab state in Syria. But the Arabs of Palestine contended that the country, being theirs, could not be given away by Faisal, an Arab from Arabia. Weizmann returned to Jerusalem empty-handed, then turned to the peace conference that was then convening in Paris, which proceeded under Britain's strong arming to deliver a major commitment to the Zionist agenda. Well, it's at this point that Vladimir Jabotinsky appears on the scene at the hub of the Zionist debates. I'll jump ahead to say that though he is barely known to Americans, it is Jabotinsky's shadow more than any other that hovers over Zionism today. Born in Odessa in 1880, Jabotinsky, like many Russian Jews, was excluded from the Russian university system and wound up in Rome, where he studied some law while becoming an admirer of Western democracy, as well as the swashbuckling Garibaldi and the Italian independence movement, the Risorgimento. On returning home to Odessa, he encountered a new round of pogroms and was active in organizing self-defense units, which were his introduction to Zionism. A talented writer, Jabotinsky is most remembered for declaring, and I quote, "Of all the necessities for national rebirth, shooting is the most important." Jabotinsky brought to Zionism a dedication to arms, which it has never given up. On a newspaper assignment at the start of World War I, Jabotinsky was in Alexandria, where he found several hundred young Russian Jews expelled by the Turks from Palestine. He proposed they organize a Jewish legion to fight alongside the British to liberate Palestine. But the local British commander proposed instead a Zionist mule corps to serve as a part of an impending attack on Gallipoli in Turkey. Though feeling insulted, Jabotinsky took the offer, and the Mule Corps served bravely. But after the battle at Gallipoli, the British disbanded it. A few years later, Jabotinsky managed to replace it with a Jewish Legion, his dream, in which he was a combat officer. The Legion, it might be noticed, was the Jews' first fighting unit since biblical times. And it also served with distinction. Britain understood by now that Jabotinsky planned to have the Jewish Legion abet Zionist ends as a military force in Palestine. After the armistice, it demobilized the Legion, as it had demobilized the Mule Corps. Jabotinsky then proceeded to organize Jewish units to defend against the Arabs, modeled on the units in Russia that aimed at defending against the pogroms. The British would not tolerate that plan either, and imprisoned Jabotinsky and some of his soldiers. Jabotinsky took the case to the British courts, and to everyone's surprise, he was successful, making him a hero among Jews worldwide. But it also intensified Jewish and British antagonism toward the Jews and sent a message that the Balfour pledges were already in retreat. In 1923, Jabotinsky published an article called The Iron Wall, which proposed that the Jews take over responsibility from the British for establishing a homeland in all of historic Palestine, and maybe a little beyond that. He urged Jews to dismiss the views, and I quote him, that Arabs are fools who can be deceived by masking our real aims, or that they are corrupt and that they can be bribed to abandon to us their claims to priority in Palestine. We may water down and sweeten our aims with honeyed words to make them palatable, but they know what we want, just as we know what they don't want. Jabotinsky predicted that the Arabs would one day come to an agreement with the Jews, but not of their own free will. Only Jewish military power, he declared, will convince them that they cannot get rid of us. By the time Jabotinsky published that article, he and Weizmann were already ideological rivals. Weizmann admired Jabotinsky, who had lived in his London home during his lobbying to organize the Jewish Legion. But Weizmann had no intention of giving up on the British, and the dedication to the British cost them heavily over the years. Weizmann had invested too much of himself in Britain's goodwill to accept Jabotinsky's militants. And meanwhile, a new center of power, created by the Balfour Declaration, was rising in Palestine's Jewish community, and Weizmann's preeminence in the Zionist movement was slowly slipping away. The emerging leader of this new community was David Ben-Gurion, whose own vision of how to shape a Jewish homeland was now creating a three-way rivalry for the Zionist leadership. Though Russian-born, like Weizmann and Jabotinsky, Ben-Gurion chose not to share their Europe-oriented lives. He decided to make his life his home in Palestine, where he migrated at the age of 20. After working as a field hand, which he didn't much like, he dabbled in socialist politics in Palestine, then decided he could be most useful to the Jews by attending law school in Constantinople. When the war began, World War I, he declared his loyalty to the Turks, but the authorities were dubious, since most of Palestine's Jews were citizens of Russia, the enemy. Ben-Gurion was among the hundreds deported to Egypt as, in today's terms, security risks. In Egypt, Ben-Gurion met Jabotinsky, who invited him to join the Mule Corps, but Ben-Gurion contended that Jews, even indirectly, should not be allied with the British. And more importantly, though indirectly allied with Russia. They must not participate in an attack on Turkey, he argued, that would justify oppression of Palestine's Jews. Under British suspicion as a pro-Turk, he was squeezed between the two belligerents and decided to go to New York, accomplished little there until 1917, when the Tsar was overthrown in St. Petersburg, and he enlisted in Jabotinsky's Legion. Though sent off to the battlefield in Palestine, he arrived too late to participate in combat. By war's end, Ben-Gurion could barely wait to get back into Zionist politics. His vision was to found institutions built on democratic socialism that would provide the backbone for the forthcoming Jewish state. It should be noted that Ben-Gurion never envisaged bringing Palestine's Arabs into the state. Herzl once extolled the benefits to the Arabs of Zionist prosperity, but Ben-Gurion regarded that as a Herzl delusion. Only a small Jewish communist sect believed in integrating the two peoples, and Ben-Gurion had never been a communist. His vision was of parallel societies in which a Jewish state took care of the Jews, while the Arabs were free to go off on their own. Ben-Gurion proved a remarkably skillful organizer, and over the ensuing years he was instrumental in founding the Labor Party, establishing a Jewish National Assembly, and creating the unique Zionist organization called Histadrut, which was part labor union, part industrial corporation, part social welfare society. The Arabs, though urged by the British to create rival institutions, stuck to their principles of protesting the mandate's legality, and while the Jews erected the framework of a state, they, the Arabs, carried out a fruitless policy of building nothing, effectively denying themselves the tool to influence the mandate's course. It should be noted that Jabotinsky thought Ben-Gurion was wasting his time on institutions as long as the Jews lacked possession of the land. As for Weizmann, Jabotinsky regarded him as a complete sellout to the British. Pursuing his own course, he gradually cut his ties with organized Zionism, preferring a campaign to militarize young Jews for the liberation. In 1925, he convoked what he called a Conference of Zionist Revisionists in Paris, its objective being to shift Zionism to a more aggressive militant course. Ultimately, revisionism was seceded from Zionism completely, producing a schism that has never healed. In the mid-1920s, Jabotinsky embraced Beitar, a Zionist youth organization, whose hub was in Poland, where it had ties to the right-wing Polish regime. In time, he became Beitar's leader, relying on its thousands of members as a military spearhead, while moving steadily away from his commitment to liberal democracy. In 1929, Beitaris triggered riots throughout Palestine by disrupting Arab prayers at Jerusalem's Wailing Wall. Hundreds of Jews and Arabs died in the disorder. Soon after these riots, the 1929 riots, when he was traveling in Europe, Britain's mandate in Palestine issued an order denying Jabotinsky a visa to return home. He never set foot in Palestine again. In his final years, he was increasingly alienated not just from Britain, but from the Zionist establishment, which he believed shared the blame. In 1933, he crossed the Rubicon, emulating other European despots in declaring that he alone would now make decisions for the revisionist movement. The revisionist membership dutifully endorsed him in a plebiscite. Ben-Gurion, alluding to Jabotinsky's fondness for Italy, which he maintained from his student days, and Italy was now led by Mussolini, Ben-Gurion responded by saying that revisionism was, quote, a putrid weed drawing sustenance from a befouled source. That same year, Chaim Arlozorov, a Ben-Gurion disciple and a rising star in the Zionist hierarchy, was shot to death while walking with his wife on a beach in Tel Aviv. Ben-Gurion and his followers accused revisionism of the murder, a charge Jabotinsky called a blood libel, invoking medieval anti-Semitism. 3 suspects, all revisionists, were arrested, but only one later freed on appeal was convicted. Jabotinsky said of his convicted follower, and I quote again, "He belongs to Beitar, and no Beitari would lie to me. I pledge my honor that he is innocent." Emotions of the murder rose to a fever among Jews worldwide, and on coming to power in the 1970s, revisionists actually reopened the case. But the Arlozorov murder was never solved. After the murder, Jabotinsky and Ben-Gurion recognized that their mutual antagonism was doing great harm to Zionism. And in the fall of 1934, they held a series of secret meetings in London in which they worked out a set of pledges, quote, to refrain from party warfare and resolve their differences in conformity with civilized conduct, if we can imagine civilized conduct. But ratification was another matter. Jabotinsky rammed approval through the revisionist Congress, but Ben-Gurion, with less personal control, was unable to contain the long-standing anger of his followers and was badly defeated in a referendum. The failure of the effort at reconciliation was a lasting blow to Zionism. Jabotinsky proceeded to take revisionism out of the Zionist organization and to go off alone. It was just as Hitler was coming to power. Zionism was no longer riven just by personal rivalries, but had become a movement bitterly divided against itself. In 1936, with Zionists growing desperate to open Palestine's doors to Europe's increasingly beleaguered Jews, the Arabs launched a new revolt directed against any British concession to Zionism, but most notably immigration. With the revisionist militia Irgun and the mainstream Jewish force, the Haganah, combining to fight the Arabs, the British mandate had become all but impotent. At that point, the cabinet in London sent the Peel Commission to Palestine to find a solution, and it wound up recommending the partition of the country into Jewish and Arab sovereign states. The offer violated the Zionist goal of a state in all of Palestine, as well as everything the Arabs proclaimed about statehood, and both Jabotinsky and the Arabs rejected it. But Ben-Gurion and Weizmann agreed that a small Jewish state was better than none, and had at the least the prospect of rescuing some of Europe's Jews. The British cabinet settled the matter, however, rejecting both partition and any loosening of Jewish immigration. In a bleak illustration of the squeeze faced by the Jews, Britain announced the decision in a white paper the day of the Nazi pogrom, known as Kristallnacht. In September 1939, the Nazis invaded Poland, and World War II was on. Ben-Gurion summed up the Jews' position in the epigram, "We shall wage war against Hitler as if there were no white paper, and wage war against the white paper as if there were no Hitler." The Jews sent recruits to fight beside the British and furnished the army with food and supplies, while the Arabs leaned increasingly toward Germany. Revisionist extremists called Lehi, sometimes called the Stern Gang, opened up a guerrilla war against the British as early as 1942. And as the Allied victory over the Nazis approached, the Irgun joined them. By then, Jabotinsky had died of a heart attack and was succeeded by Menachem Begin, a disciple whose ideology was even more extreme, even more rigid than that of his mentor. In 1947, Britain announced the end of the Palestine Mandate, and in May 1948, Ben-Gurion declared Israel's independence. At that point, the Jews' war against the Arabs began. Ben-Gurion and Begin as the revisionist commander, agreed in theory on the need to unify their forces, but they were not able to reach agreement on the command structure, not an inconsequential disagreement. Ben-Gurion's main goal was to forge a government, and he insisted all the armed forces serve under a central command. Begin, who had thought little about governance, demanded the autonomy to command his own soldiers. The issue split the two sides irrevocably. In 1946, Irgun bombed the King David Hotel, the British headquarters, and a little bit later massacred hundreds of Arab civilians in the village of Deir Yassin during the siege of Jerusalem. Most traumatically, the two Jewish sides shed each other's blood over the Altalena. The Altalena was a ship bearing Jabotinsky's pen name that brought Beitar recruits and heavy weapons, unannounced, into Palestine, leading Ben-Gurion to suspect that Begin's aim was to overthrow the government. When Begin refused to give up the cargo, the Haganah attacked his men. The ship was sunk and dozens of Jewish lives were lost. The issue of unifying the forces of the revisionists and the mainstream Zionists split the two sides, ripped them apart. In 1946, Irgun bombed the King David Hotel, the British headquarters, against the will of Ben-Gurion, and then, and a little later, massacred hundreds of Arab civilians in the village of Deir Yassin during the siege of Jerusalem. Most traumatically, the two Jewish sides shed each other's blood over the Altalena. The Altalena was a ship bearing Jabotinsky's pen name that brought Beitar recruits and heavy weapons unannounced into Palestine, leading Ben-Gurion to suspect that Begin's aim was to overthrow the government. When Begin refused to give up the cargo, the Haganah attacked his men. The ship was sunk and dozens of Jewish lives were lost. The King David, Deir Yassin, and the Altalena affair still resound in the accounts of the founding of the Jewish state. Now, I know you're generally familiar with Ben-Gurion's skillful management of the War of Independence of the Jewish forces, and I won't dwell on it. Under his command, Israel defeated first the Palestinian, then the armies of the 5 Arab countries that surrounded Israel, increasing Israel's territory during the course of these battles by some 20% over what was allotted in the UN partition resolution of 1947. The war also reduced Palestine's Arab population by roughly half, with whole communities fleeing after Deir Yassin, while many others were driven out on Ben-Gurion's direct orders. They created a refugee population that has since grown into millions. Nor did the ceasefire accord between Israel and the Arab states in 1949 end the violence. Neither Jews nor Arabs were ready to make peace. Combat continued along the fluid borders, much of it at the instigation of Ben-Gurion himself, who was ever ready to use his military forces to impose the Jewish state's dominance over its neighbors. Oddly, it seems, Ben-Gurion chose not to occupy the West Bank in 1948 when he had the opportunity. One reason was that Jordan's Arab Legion, commanded by British officers, held the area, and the Israeli army, its generals, had no desire to engage in a war involving Britain. Ben-Gurion also recognized that hundreds of thousands of the Arabs who lived on the West Bank, the preponderance of them angry refugees, that they would divert resources from the Holocaust survivors whom the Jewish state had made a commitment to integrate. Sensible as that decision was, Begin was furious. and 20 years later, the issue reopened dramatically with the West Bank's capture in the Six-Day War. Since then, its fate, as you all know, the fate of the West Bank, has kept the Middle East in a state of ongoing instability. Israel's intoxication following its victory in the Six-Day War, succeeded by the scary experience of the Yom Kippur War in 1973, in effect transformed Israeli society. Militant constituencies, after years of hibernation, emerged to demand retaining the occupied territory. They were led by Begin and the revisionists, who had been waiting for the opportunity since Jabotinsky's time. But there were also others. Much of Israel's triumphant military contended that security would not permit returning the territory to the Arabs. But there also arose, unanticipated, perhaps the most important innovation, a fiery religious movement, heir to the religious Zionists of the Herzl era. For decades, little had been heard of them, even though Rav Avraham Isaac Kook and his son, Rabbi Zvi Yehuda Kook, preached that the land of Palestine was holier than the Torah. The father died in 1935, but the son and his apostles, many trained in the family yeshiva, sparked the establishment of Gush Emonim, a group that defied the state in building, without authorization, religious settlements throughout the occupied lands. In 1977, as the new wave of thinking continued to spread, Israeli voters overthrew their long-standing commitment to Ben-Gurion's Labor Party and elected Menachem Begin their prime minister. Well, at first it was assumed that Begin's election was an aberration, reflecting the blame directed at labor for Israel's near collapse during the Yom Kippur War. But Begin had been losing elections since independence, and blame for the near defeat was at most only part of the explanation. Israeli politics changed because the electorate changed. In addition to the revisionists, a generation of Sephardim, that is, Jews from the Arab lands, had reached maturity, resentful that the Ben-Gurion camp had for too long ruled as if by a natural right inherited from Herzl. They were joined by the religious Zionists of the Kook school, who moved toward a religious fundamentalism that seemed to be setting up beachheads throughout much of the world. Finally, Jews from the Soviet Union, with no ties to liberal democracy, were arriving in large numbers and would soon reach 1 million, a fifth of Israel's Jewish population. Combined, these Israelis rejected the establishment. Begin was not just the revisionist adversary. He was the non-establishment alternative who appeared at a time when a majority of Israelis had grown weary of the establishment. Begin led Israel into an anti-establishment era where a majority of voters, a slim majority, but a majority nonetheless, where the Israeli electorate stands today. Begin's great achievement was to make peace with Egypt, even though the outraged religious Zionists, as well as revisionists, were profoundly objected to giving up Jewish settlements in the Sinai. His refusal of any concession to the Palestinians, however, and his resentment's expansion of settlements suppressed the chances of any accord over the West Bank and its companion, the Gaza Strip, though these had become the central element in the Arab-Israeli conflict. True to Jabotinsky, Begin seized on Egypt's withdrawal from the conflict to initiate an attack on Lebanon in 1982 to crush the PLO forces that he believed stood in the way of Israel's domination over the Palestinians. The Lebanon War was not just Israel's greatest military failure. Its heavy casualties led directly to Begin's resignation and a major blow to Israel's good name in the global community. Benjamin Netanyahu, as we all know, has been the dominant figure in Israeli politics ever since Begin left office 30 years ago. There have been other prime ministers, most notably Yitzhak Rabin, an ex-general whose effort to make peace ended in his murder by a religious Zionist claiming inspiration from the rabbis of the Kook school. Revisionist leadership abroad, in place of peace, a second deadly war in Lebanon, 3 bloody intifadas, and 3 brutal invasions of Gaza, an astonishing record for just a few years. The record might have made Jabotinsky proud, but wouldn't Herzl ask what happened to the secure Jewish homeland to which he gave his life? Netanyahu is the son of a revisionist historian who was serving as secretary to Jabotinsky when Jabotinsky died in New York in 1940. The son followed in his father's ideological footsteps. He learned English in American schools while his father taught at American universities. On returning to Israel, he served in the army, then entered revisionist politics. He was Israel's ambassador to the United Nations, then became leader of the revisionist Likud party. Elected prime minister after Rabin's murder, he wasn't popular, and in 1999 he was defeated for re-election. He then announced his retirement from politics to go into business. Well, his retirement was very brief, and much of it was spent in writing a book, ironically entitled A Durable Peace, in which he denied to the Arabs any claim whatsoever, whether to land in Palestine, much less a state in Palestine. When Prime Minister Ariel Sharon, the ex-military hero who had assembled the coalition that became the Likud party, chose to withdraw from Gaza in the face of the rising casualties of the Palestinian Intifada, Netanyahu led a party rebellion that ousted him and restored his own leadership. He, Netanyahu, was reelected prime minister in 2009 and has since held the office, imbuing it with a dedication, despite occasional verbal equivocation, to Israel's permanent military rule over the 3 million Arabs now living in Jerusalem and the occupied territories. Well, that gets us where we are today, and I'd like to end by returning briefly to Ben-Gurion. No saint, but a practical man. So why, if he was so practical, has it been so hard in our times to distinguish Ben-Gurion's disciples from Jabotinsky's? It was Jabotinsky, after all, who declared that once Jews demonstrated their military superiority, the Arabs would change their minds about peace. Surely it can be argued that the Arabs have changed their minds about peace, but neither Ben-Gurion's nor Jabotinsky's camp has shown an interest in joining them in a serious quest to end the conflict. In the most recent Israeli election, there was not even a credible peace party. Has history, as I once wrote in an earlier book, permanently scarred the Jewish psyche, the Jewish political vision? Will Israel ever prefer peace with the Palestinians over military domination? Nachum Gomen, a peace advocate who once led the World Zionist Organization, wrote in his memoir about a late-night conversation over coffee and sandwiches after Ben-Gurion's retirement to his home in the Negev. The subject was peace. Goldman recalls Ben-Gurion's musing, "Why should the Arabs make peace? If I was an Arab leader, I never would. That is natural. we have taken their country away from them. So we have to stay strong and maintain a powerful army. That is why I never shrank from giving orders which I knew would mean the death of hundreds of wonderful young Jewish men. Otherwise, the Arabs would wipe us out. Goldman, like most of us, credited Ben-Gurion for the structure that made Israel a modern, prosperous, democratic state. But in conditions of endless war, he asked, how long can it survive? Ben-Gurion replied to his question, ask me whether my son Amos, who will soon be 50, has a chance of dying and being buried in a Jewish state. I would answer 50-50. Goldman then asked, but how can you sleep with that prospect in mind? Ben-Gurion hesitated a moment, then replied, who says I sleep? Thank you very much. I appreciate you.
Thank you for that excellent talk, a really great condensation of the book. With so many people here today, you've packed the house. I'm not going to talk too much myself because I want to give the audience an opportunity to ask some questions. But I do just want to start. You had mentioned that Jabotinsky is one of the lesser known of the kind of Zionist forebears, one of the big leaders. Even lesser known are the Cooks, the Rav Cook and his son. But one could argue, and I think you do basically argue in your book, that the kind of fusion or the combination of these two ideals, revisionist Zionism and the religious Zionism of the Cooks, essentially characterize what you call the Begin era, in which Israel is still living. Would you agree with that?
I wrote it, so I would agree with it.
So, sorry.
Yes. Can I stand up there at the podium? Was that your...
If you would prefer, yeah, exactly.
That way I get to see this wonderful audience. Yeah, it is a complex situation, and I tried to put the pieces of this very complex mosaic together in a way that would be comprehensible. But after the Yom Kippur, after the 6-Day War, and then the Yom Kippur War, following very quickly upon one another, there really was a transformation of the Israeli outlook on the world. And it had. I mean, we knew by that time about the revisionists and about Jabotinsky. We didn't know anything at all about the rabbis Cook and what they had introduced to religious Zionism. It was natural that a lot of the generals and colonels would say, we have to hold on to the land for reasons of security. We can't give it back. But all of these forces came together, and they became a new a new major power in Israeli politics that nobody had anticipated prior to the 6-Day War. And it's with us today. It is still the dominant force in Israel, in my judgment. And although occasionally we see some glimmers of a close rivalry between this new force and the more moderate force represented by Rabin and represented quite inadequately by the present leadership of the Labor Party. But there are some glimmers of a prospect for their coming close in an election. In fact, Netanyahu only won the last election by a single seat, but he manages to hold on to his power. That under the Israeli parliamentary system, it works very well. But Israel itself seems to have lost its vigor in behalf of making peace with its neighbors, and I don't know when, if ever, that vigor will ever return.
You talked a little bit about Benjamin Netanyahu, what he wrote in his book, and you know, as you note, his father was actually Jabotinsky's personal secretary when Jabotinsky was here in the United States. So he has a long, you know, revisionist tradition in his own family, and yet the Zionism he espouses, even though he is not overtly religious, is actually much closer, it seems to me, to the religious Zionism of the Cooks, in that it recognizes no legitimacy to the Arab claims. At least Jabotinsky recognized, listen, I understand why the Arabs don't want us here. Even if he didn't agree with their grievances, he at least recognized where they came from.
Well, I don't think that I don't think that Netanyahu in any way is a religious Zionist. There's nothing religious about him, as you say. He seems to be an eminently I was about to say sexual, but what I really mean was a secular man. Um, um, but but the amazing thing about what has happened in politics since the Yom Kippur War is how these various sources, these various root political structures have coalesced over the same issues. And I think that's what's happened. Maybe that's a coincidence, call it what you like, but the fact is that three very different bodies of thought have come together and have made peace increasingly difficult to pursue.
So I think we can go to the audience. Please, if I could just set a few ground rules. If you could, please identify yourself. Please keep your question brief, and please do phrase it in the form of a question.
Thank you very much. Do you want me to stand?
Do you mind standing up?
Sure. My name is Daniel Wakar. I have a question. Thank you very much for your talk. I listened to it and I really enjoyed it, but one word I didn't hear you mention was democracy, or the concept of democratic values, and how that factors into.
You have to talk more slowly so I can.
Sure. I enjoyed your talk, but one phrase or word that I didn't hear you mention was democracy or democratic values, or how that factors into your discussion of Zionism. And as I'm sure you know, there's this modern discussion of whether Israel can be a Jewish state or a democratic state or both or neither. In your research, in your book, how does this play out? How does this discussion play out over the course of history, and especially now?
Well, at the moment, it's playing out very badly because, as you know, Netanyahu has been very busy. Netanyahu and his allies in the Knesset have been very busy promoting legislation which would limit democracy, just as Erdogan was doing in Turkey at the same time. It makes you wonder whether there's any relationship to these things happening at the same time in neighboring places. In fact, maybe we're experiencing the same thing in the United States at this moment, which is certainly one way to look at what we're going through now. But I do not see much of a commitment among the opposition parties, or certainly effective commitment among the opposition party, to retaining the purity of liberal democracy now, because the religious Zionists don't care much about it. The Russians certainly don't care much about it. The revisionists once upon a time cared something about it, but have lost their commitment to it. So I would think that liberal democracy in Israel is severely endangered. I wish I could say otherwise, but I think it is. And I need not point out that that seems to be true throughout much of the world at the moment. Certainly the world to the west of Afghanistan, there seems to be a rise of intolerance for democracy, which we did not anticipate 10 or 20 years ago.
I'm glad you mentioned the political moment in the U.S. because when I was reading your account of how Begin came to power, riding a wave of anti-elite and anti-establishment resentment, it just seemed all very familiar.
Well, I wrote all of that. I wrote all of that part of the book before Donald Trump came around, and I don't want to get diverted into Donald Trump tonight.
It's so easy.
We're going to hear enough of it when we go home and turn on our television sets. But the fact is that there are certain parallels that seem to be shadowing us in a very scary way.
In the the back, sir.
Steve France with Seville, DC. It seems to me that maybe you give Herzl a little bit too easy a ride in terms of his ideal being something that was so enlightened and to be admired. I think he had some very bellicose quotes, and his background in German romantic nationalism and the nationalism of the late 19th century was very much built on sort of macho bellicosity. So maybe what's happened is that that part of Herzl's ideal of nationalism has over the decades simply been borne out, that it's a military project and it has no other way to exist as an ethnic national enterprise.
Well, I think you are. I would say that you're making certain valid points, but I don't think Herzl ever thought through a lot of these things. I mean, his idea was a much more charitable one. We have to save these Jews who are in danger. He did not think much of democracy. He did not think he was struck. He was astounded by the way democracy was working so poorly in France at the turn of the century. I don't think of him as a rabid nationalist because I don't think as a matter of fact, he talked about in the Jewish State, the book, The Jewish State, about we will establish an army, but it will be a peaceful army and it will spend all of its time in its barracks. We do not expect to use it in any kind of aggressive fashion, even though the rabbi warned him about that. The one I quoted, it's a quote that you almost never see. In fact, I was rather astounded to get it when he was the chief rabbi of Vienna at the time, who said, "Look, we're embarked on a course which may very well lead us to the kind of routine that German nationalism and French and Habsburg nationalism will." But I don't think that I don't think I am being too soft on Herzl by saying I don't think he has thought all of these things through. I mean, he could have been just as easily the founder of the Red Cross. That was the way he looked upon his role in the service to the Jews. And you don't really find anything in all of his memoirs about establishing a great nation or using our force in behalf of this or that, or bringing some service to the Middle East. He's talking about saving a lot of people, and that was his concern.
This woman in the back here.
What would you say about the role of labor Zionism in establishing Israel or a state in Palestine as Jewish as England was English, given the Avodah Ivrit movement, given the founding of Keren Kayemet, and their general policy of dunam by dunam, liberating the land from the Palestinians and resulting in their economic dispossession really as early as the beginning of the mandate and even before it. I mean, it's very...
I'm sorry, can you just speak up a little bit?
I'm having... Did you understand?
I didn't get all of that. But
Okay. My question is, wouldn't you say that labor Zionism with the Avodah Ivrit movement and with its land policy and its dunam by dunam policy of liberating land, in quotes, from the Palestinians as much a part of dispossessing the Palestinians and making sure that there could never be peace between the two peoples, as you might blame revisionism for, and later the religious Zionists for doing?
Okay, so I think the question is, isn't labor Zionism as culpable as revisionist Zionism in the displacement of the Palestinians, rather than posing a binary, labor better, revisionist worse when it comes to Palestinian rights? Aren't they both to blame?
The answer is yes. And I try to make that clear in the remarks that I made, that Ben-Gurion was not a very saintly character in terms of dealing with Israel's neighbors. Um, I think that there was less ideology and more pragmatism to the Ben-Gurion school than there was to the revisionists, which allowed for a little bit more flexibility in terms of dealing with the Arabs. Rabin was a very committed labor Zionist, raised on labor Zionist values, and he was wise enough during that brief period that he was prime minister to recognize that it was time to make peace with the Palestinians, and we all know what happened to him. So I think that you don't have to exculpate the Labor Party or Labor Party thinking, because Zionism, let's face it, Zionism was an effort to, as Ben-Gurion said in those last remarks that he had in the conversation with Nachum Goldman, we took over the land, and that was Labor Party thinking. Ben-Gurion, it didn't bother Herzl. Herzl was sure, as some other Zionists over the course of the long years of Zionist thought, Herzl really thought that the Jewish presence in Palestine would benefit the Palestinians, and he clearly hadn't thought this through. But yeah, I make no effort whatever to exculpate labor Zionism in the situation that we're in at the moment.
Okay, I think we have time for one more. Do we have any up? No. Okay, let's go to Paul down here.
Thanks, Milton, for another excellent book and bringing up all the strands you did. I'm not a fan of Jabotinsky, but
You're not a
I
fan of what?
think of Jabotinsky, as you know.
Okay.
But I think you make him bear a much heavier burden than he did. He really should. I think he spent the last 8 years of his life trying to defend his movement against the right-wingers like Abba Ache Meir and Avram Stern and people like that. And I think he was far more of a Democrat than Begin, and Begin's successors, I think, were far different from Begin. Begin had a respect for democracy. Last point, I think, in my view, you shouldn't talk about the two Cooks as similar, because the elder Rav Kook had nothing of the violent nationalist fervor that his son did. But what do you think of those comments?
Well, I'll start with the Cooks because I have a whole chapter, and rather little has been written about the Cooks. Quite a lot has been written about the Cooks as the Rav Kook, the father, as a philosopher, as a theologian. I don't really deal very much with that because I don't quite get it. I mean, he was a very mystical thinker and very hard to grasp. but he did every once in a while reveal himself, and I think he more than anybody else was the central figure in transforming Judaism into a land-oriented, a land-based theology than anybody else. I mean, what the Rav did was to say land was more important than the Torah. I used that quote in the course of somewhere in this talk, and his son accepted that, and now he has a whole school of not only rabbis coming out of his own yeshiva, and he was also the founder of a yeshiva, but also who have followed him. Gush Hamonim followed him in that period after the Yom Kippur War. As far as Jabotinsky is concerned, well, my own opinion of Jabotinsky changed as I did research on him, because he was a very much more, in my judgment, admirable young man than he was as an older man. He was smart. I mean, yeah. And he's not the only one you could say that about. But Jabotinsky was a pleasure to read. I read a couple of his novels, and you could really feel a deep kind of set of values that were quite attractive. But then he got so profoundly caught up in this power struggle with Ben-Gurion. By that time, Weizmann was pretty much on the side of it all. That I think he changed, and I think he just became a lot more attractive as a thinker, and he has gone down, at least on the part of most of us, as a rather unpleasant man who brought a rather unpleasant set of ideas into Zionism. But it didn't necessarily start out that way. It just worked out that way. But that's not the first time that such a sequence arises.
All right, well, I think we've gotten just a taste of what this book has to offer. We will have books for sale. Again, I can't recommend it highly enough. I think it's a great contribution to our understanding of these issues. And please join me in thanking Milton Viorst.